I believe we are live on Facebook. I'm David Zuckerman, your Lieutenant Governor and candidate for governor, and we're doing this conversation today, a legislative recap, continuing of our series. We've done them on healthcare and economic policy and workers, as well as the COVID relief funds. And today we're going to be talking about transportation. We know it's a much broader topic than just cars and gas and trucks. And we're going to be talking about the broad range of transportation issues, some of which also include some climate issues and economic related issues as well. Vermont's a very rural state. I think we all know that. 61% of our population is living in what the census defines as a rural area. And since I mentioned the word census, I should point out it is important to fill out your census. If you got to mail one, send it in. You could do it online. But filling out the census is really important for the resources that the federal government sends here based on how many people we have and where you live. And they come up with these kinds of statistics like 61% of our population lives in rural areas in Vermont. The availability of reliable transportation is a vital issue for many Vermonters. We know getting to and from work is a real challenge for folks. And transportation is responsible for more than 35% of the total energy consumed in Vermont. So as we are thinking about our economy, but we're also thinking about our climate, that's a lot of energy use, and it's primarily fossil fuel. Joining me today for a conversation around transportation issues are Senator Andrew Perchlik, who's a member of the Senate Committee on Transportation, and Jenn Wood. She's a climate reality leader and mentor. She was trained by Vice President Al Gore. She's the founding chapter chair of the Vermont chapter of the Climate Reality Project and is on the board of CarShare Vermont. We had intended to also have Representative Kurt McCormick here. He's the chair of the House Committee on Transportation, where we've been having some technical difficulties getting him in. In the new Zoom era, these things happen. And in the challenging broadband era, these things happen. But I want to welcome Senator Andrew Perchlik and Jenn Wood. Welcome.
Thank you, David. Did you want us to say something at this point?
Yeah, just a hello and thank you. That's great. Jenn? Yeah.
Hi, yeah, thanks, David. You see that my picture was up there. I apologize. I'm, as you also can probably see, camping. So the broadband is also an issue here. So I'm gonna keep my video off so I can at least chat with you, and maybe we'll pop in the video if and when that works. But thank you all for signing in, and I look forward to the conversation. So.
Great, thank you. I also want to announce, at least on the Zoom side, Representative Mari Cordes is here listening in and joining us. We've had a lot of different legislators listening to these either through Zoom or Facebook as well. As we all bring more to the table, we also learn more from all of these conversations. For those of you watching live, feel free to leave questions or thoughts in the comment section, and we will try to bring them into the conversation. And today, we're going to start our conversation by talking about the challenges many Vermonters, particularly those in those more rural areas, and those who have economic challenges, minimum wage workers and other low wage workers. What are the challenges many Vermonters face with transportation, and then what are we currently doing to address it? And I'm going to start with Senator Perchlik to talk about just the world of transportation. He serves on that committee, and some of the things that we're doing to try to adjust transportation in rural areas. Senator. And it looks like his screen may be freezing up as well. In which case, while he's frozen, we will go to Jenn, who might be able to talk about some of the work she's done, and also CarShare in respect to rural versus some of the more dense areas. I don't really know if CarShare reaches out to some of those rural areas, but maybe you could talk about some of those challenges, Jenn.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think probably everybody here knows the greenhouse gas impact challenges, that transportation is by far our biggest source of carbon emission or greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont, and likewise, it by far has the most energy burden. So the household expenses that one pays on transportation are much higher than, you say, your electricity and thermal, and of course that's exacerbated for not only low-income communities but for the rural communities. And so, with respect to CarShare, they're predominantly in the Burlington area. They had tried a pilot in Montpelier. And that wrapped up, but things have shifted, and it seems like they, like public transit, took a dip at the beginning of the pandemic, but they're seeing kind of an upsurge. There's a lot of people that are recognizing that maybe they don't need two cars or maybe not even one, and finding other alternative mobility options. So there may be an opportunity to expand it because it's not there now, and it looks like Senator is back, so I'll pause there and see if he wants to chime in.
Senator, did you hear the question before you froze up? Do you want me to repeat the question? You got to unmute.
Transportation challenges? That
Yeah,
was?
particularly in rural areas and those with economic struggles, and kind of what is being done to address this, or what could be done in the future potentially as well.
Well, that's what I learned. One of the biggest things I took away from my 2 years on the Transportation Committee is how much transportation is critical to meeting a lot of our other needs and meeting Vermonters' needs. When I would meet with other people outside of the Transportation Committee, because I remember one time I met with some reach-up workers, and they brought up transportation as the #1 issue. Like, having difficulty getting people to their job is a main issue. If we want to, have people get out of poverty, they need to have jobs, and they need to be able to get to those jobs. So whether that's public transportation or getting them a car, that was a critical issue. And it would come up in many other issues, any other conversations I'd have in the State House. Transportation came up as a major issue. And when I work with Capstone that works here in Washington County and Lamoille County, they would say the same thing. Transportation is like the #1 issue in trying to help their clients. And I hadn't really realized that before I had gotten in there. So we really have been trying to work that on the committee, is how can we help these folks? So last year we passed some money to do some pilot programs, specifically trying to address this issue of helping low-income folks have reliable transportation.
Thank you. That's really helpful. As we know, connected to public transportation, I was on a forum recently trying to figure out public transportation in rural areas, how to make it work, because you don't quite have the density you need to get ridership. And then there's the concept of microtransit. And I suppose it could be defined in different ways. And I'd like to ask you all to elaborate on it. And is it a form of public transit that involves, or it is a form of public transit that involves operating smaller scale on-demand services, and maybe there's more flexibility in those routes, but is that something that could work or not? And can you expand on what microtransit is and why maybe it's promising, and where has it been tried? Maybe some examples. And Jen, if you know about that, we'll go with you first, even though it was supposed to be Andrew first last time, but I'm gonna go to Jen if you've got some thoughts, then we'll go to Andrew again.
Sure. Yes. So microtransit is actually, there's efforts underway in Vermont. It's there's a pilot. There's kind of it's in process, and there's a pilot to happen in Montpelier. So there's 3. If folks are familiar with the public transit routes, there's kind of 3 circulator routes that oscillate around and pick people up. And essentially those will go away, and it will be an on-demand, a la Uber, Lyft style program, so that it's actually gets you to your doorstep. You don't have to meet just at the bus stops. So it's on demand. They're estimating that within 15 minutes, you get the ride from when you book it, either through the app or on the phone if you don't have kind of a smartphone access. And the good thing with this pilot is that one of the things I think that's good is that it integrates, regular kind of choice riders with some Medicaid, kind of medical appointment services, because in public transit, particularly in rural, that's one of the challenges, is trying to, the barriers, I should say, is, whether you want to integrate public transit with school buses or with kind of Medicaid supported rides, there's sort of these funding barriers that weighs out money that's allocated, can't be used. But this is sort of breaking that up a little bit. So it'll be an exciting opportunity. And I know that a lot of towns have their eyes on it. It could, if it works, Montpelier will be the smallest city to have ever successfully implemented a microtransit program. But if it does work, then St. Albans, St. Jay, Rutland, many places, Brattleboro, Bennington, I would say all of those, if not even smaller, could also utilize the program. I also live in the islands and desperately would love some more expansion of public transit up there in whatever form. And so I know, there's folks up there that are interested in partnering on something there. So that's, kind of that's the status, and I'll let Andy chime in.
Senator Perchlik, has that been discussed in the Senate Transportation Committee in the realm of all the different options? And maybe you can tell us some about that.
Yes, it's been a big topic, and we're really at least I'm really hoping that it does work out in Montpelier. As Jen said, AOT did apply for a federal grant. They didn't get the federal grant, but because of the promise, they found the money to support the microtransit pilot project in Montpelier. Hope it'll go on 2 years, but if it's successful, just prove this model that you don't, instead of just having one bus that just does a circuit, and we've all seen those buses, there's, even before COVID, there might be 3 or 4 folks on it, people waiting at the bus. It has its difficulties, and we're always trying to figure out how can we get more people to ride the buses. And this really just takes a whole different look at it and saying, why not have the car come to your house? Just have a group of like small vans that drive around instead of one big bus that does a circuit. And we're pretty confident that this will increase ridership. And if it does increase ridership compared to the circuit buses, then as Jen said, it'll be picked up in other communities. And it has a lot of other benefits. It makes it also a lot easier to electrify these smaller vehicles than the bigger buses, even though we do have electric buses and that technology is coming along. We're much further along with like a minivan, electric minivan, or a mini transportation bus that holds 10 or 11, 12 passengers, or a 50-passenger van. So there's a lot of promise with the Montpelier project, which will start in January. AOT put out a RFP for the software, because you'll have on your smartphone. But as Jen said, if you don't have a smartphone, you can make a phone call. But so they're working on it right now. So we'll start in January. And Sustainable Montpelier is the group in Montpelier that's going to be promoting it, because it's going to be critical that people don't show up on the normal day and the bus isn't there, because the buses won't be running. You can't really do both of them at the same time. So we got to be clear, do a really good job of community outreach. But the other microtransit thing that's happening, which we did put some money in the T-bill this year for, is a more innovative approaches. We put $400,000 into a program. It's just called Innovative Microtransit Projects, and Capstone is working on a project where it would focus on their clients' needs. And I think it's a model of microtransit that would work maybe in a more rural area, where the cars are owned in a cooperative, kind of like car share that Jen works with, but maybe as a more cooperative, different people own these vehicles. Capstone could hire people that need work to be the drivers, and it really focuses on getting the clients, the people that don't have vehicles, to their appointments, their jobs, all these kind of things. It's the other thing that I didn't mention earlier is when I would talk just in my community outreach, talk like the Central Vermont Hospital, they have a huge issue of getting people to appointments. And this is prior COVID, but if we want to have a good public health system, we need to find a way of getting people to their medical appointments and getting the medical care that they need. A lot of people don't get the care they need because they can't get a ride to the hospital in a reliable way. So microtransit makes it easier, because these people that might have mobility challenges don't have to get down to a bus stop, even though there's other programs specifically for them. But this would make that integrated, as Jen was saying earlier, to the regular riders.
Great, thanks for that update. I did not know much about microtransit, and I imagine many others didn't either. So that's really helpful for people to start to hear and understand what that is. And as you said, in Montpelier, there'll have to be quite a bit of outreach to make sure people are ready for it. But I hope that's successful. We've focused a lot on fuel-based transportation, and Senator Perchlik just recently alluded to electric buses. And there is a big move towards the electrification of transportation, both cars, buses, and other forms of transportation. And we're thinking about, covers personal vehicles, maybe a state fleet. I think there's been some looking into that, and you can maybe address that a little bit. School buses, trains, and just the everyday buses that we see. So let's take a few minutes to explore where we are with electrification of transportation, how it could impact the costs of transportation, and the role it may play in mitigating the climate crisis. And I'm going to go with you first, Andy. You can tell us a little bit about some of the shifts that you helped make happen in the Senate, but the broader picture of alternative fuel-based transportation options.
Yeah, and I think what we'll end up seeing is where electric vehicles will no longer be seen as the alternative. At least that's the hope, that that'll be the mainstay. And if we are going to reduce the climate impact of transportation, there's really no way around electrification of the of our personal cars, but also moving people to public transportation and then having those be electrified eventually. We put money into the rebate program that's still going, so people can get a rebate off the cost of electric vehicles. We've participated in federal grant programs that have brought in a lot, a lot more than we had before, but we have 4 or 6 electric buses of different sizes. So we're going to be testing those out for the next couple of years, see how they work in the winters and on the different routes. And so that we can learn from that and then continue to expand those projects. And I think we would continue to support putting money into those types of programs. But one of the issues that we have is how we just kind of relate all this new electricity to our electric system. We have a pretty clean electric portfolio in Vermont. Only like 2% of our greenhouse gases come from electricity. But as we move more and more cars, when we're talking like 10 years out, we also will need more electricity, and we want that to be renewable. And it's something that we've started to talk about in the Transportation Committee. It's where these committees overlap, where we talk about, well, how are we going to address this impact on our electric grid, and how are electric car drivers going to pay for the infrastructure that they're not paying through the gas tax? We have relied heavily on the gas tax. The federal government hasn't raised the gas tax for decades. The state is kind of underfunding our infrastructure. So we want to be very encouraging of the electrification, but we also have to figure out how to allow those people, and the electric car owners want to pay to help the infrastructure. So we're trying to figure out how we do that. There's a lot of interest, and we have tasked Agency of Transportation to study that this year and come back next year with some recommendations on how best to fairly and equitably move forward on that issue.
Nice. Jenn, can you offer some thoughts from what you've learned and can share about some of the alternative, although maybe not in the future, alternative forms of transportation?
Sure. So I think, and just to add a little bit on the kind of the T-bill side of things and AOT, if I'm understanding correctly, that there's funds and there's work underway now, I think particularly from the Volkswagen settlement, that there's that AOT is in the process of installing DC fast chargers all across Vermont, such that it would be, like everybody would have one within 30 miles of their house. So sort of they're bolstering up the infrastructure. And I think there was, extra money put in the T-bill to add to that EV infrastructure, and also some language that if there's, say, extra money in the maintenance budget, that would then go to addressing either EVs or components of the comprehensive energy plan, which I think is great. And I see Andy nodding. I don't know if you can see that. So that sounds like that's correct. And then, a couple other, points that I want to make is that, there is a huge opportunity, as Andy mentioned. There's a number of EV buses across the state, and that are, and some are doing kind of more intensive studies of, how it's working. I just heard that although it is the summer and it'll be a test in the winter, that the buses in the Burlington area and Green Mountain Transit are actually performing above what they were anticipated right now. So the range, that is, of the buses. So that was great. One of the other big pieces that I think about is also the health impacts. I honestly dream of a day of like going down to the DTC and I don't have to hear the noise of the buses running and smell the fumes. I think a lot of people can appreciate that. There's other kind of health factors in addition to all the incredible greenhouse gas emission factors. And one thing I think that we could and push and lean on is Governor Scott just signed on to that multi-state agreement for encouraging heavy duty vehicles. So I think that's a leverage point to kind of push, because Tesla and tons of other companies are coming out with semis and other larger transportation vehicles. And you mentioned that I'm part of the Climate Reality Project, and I just completed a training with Vice President Gore, and it was global training, virtual. Of course, they had intended to have 5 trainings across the U.S., but I think because we have an election coming up, so they focus on the U.S. because usually they do all over the world. But they did a global training, and there were 10,000 people that participated, so it was absolutely incredible. But what I wanted to share is that they, Mr. Gore put in some even more up-to-date transportation factors. We already know it's our biggest greenhouse gas emissions, not only Vermont, but in the United States as a whole. But there is actually EV electric vehicles and fossil fuel-based cars are about to hit, parity, grid parity in terms of, the cost. So it's going to be just as cost effective and hopefully more cost effective soon to get an electric vehicle. So just phasing out fossil fuel vehicles. Yeah. And that there's already 35 cities across the world that have committed to only EV buses by 2025. And right now in Shanghai and Shenzhen, China, that's all that they, operate or purchase going forward. So there's an opportunity to really take a lead, I think, in just committing to, only purchasing electric buses going forward. And then I think the state can have, a way to incentivize that. There are certain incentives, and electric utilities are contributing, but I see opportunities to maybe even expand tier 3 in ways that they could allow more opportunities for additional funding to support that. Since I'm talking about funding, I wanted to put in a plug too. I put in a plug that, of course, we're going to need additional dollars, but there's real challenges, particularly with the state that the world is in right now. And so I feel like it's also a prime opportunity to really tease through how are existing funds being used and how can we maybe reallocate those funds towards more environmentally friendly options versus supporting just a fossil fuel-based infrastructure. Of course, buses need to operate on the roads, but I think there's a lot of other opportunities. I'm sure we'll get into other alternative transportation projects, but that's another area where I think, again, budgets are going to be highly scrutinized. So there's a chance to see, where can we maybe shift dollars. So.
And most of these, this is a slightly off topic, but it's related to transportation. I know there's still a lot of people that bike in Vermont for much of the year. There's real concern on some of the busier 2-lane roads. Andy, can you remind us, did we pass some laws a couple of years ago to try to protect bicyclists with a bigger passing space? Maybe just talk about that for a moment. And are the buses all set up to be able to also carry bicycles if people were to bike to bus stops?
Yeah, I think most of the buses are, at least all the ones I've seen. And we do have complete streets, which I think is what you're talking about, which requires AOT whenever doing a new road project to incorporate widening the shoulders of the road to incorporate making it easier to bike and walk along these roads, just for bike and pedestrian efforts. Yeah, and it's too bad Representative McCormick is on, because that's definitely something that he's passionate about. And we were able to agree with the House of adding a little bit of money to the T-bill this year to increase grants to local communities to increase, bicycle and pedestrian paths. The state has put a lot of money into this year into the Lamoille Valley Rail Trail, which is more seen as a recreational trail, but I think it has a lot of value as a corridor for actually commuting or getting to places. And as people experience what it's like to just ride on a bike path instead of along a busy road with cars and trucks, they see it as a greater opportunity. And that, since it was an old railroad, it does go through a lot of towns. So I'm hoping that it's much more than just a recreational path in the future. And as you go to other countries that really invest in bike paths, they don't just try to add all their bike paths to the shoulder of the road. They create special bike paths. That's the way to really get people to ride bikes all the time. And so we definitely are working on that. It's a big part of what AOT does is making sure that people can get around with other forms of transportation, and biking is a big thing for sure. A couple other things on the last question that I will throw in why
Sure. Yeah.
the screen, so to speak, is that you talked about affordability. Driving an electric car is cheaper than driving a gas car. The electric cars are still a little more expensive up front, but as Jen said, the parity is coming pretty close with the savings over a lifetime. It pays off for that little bit of the extra expense, and every year they're cheaper and there's more options. And that's the same with the electric buses. Just as there's very little maintenance, there's no transmission fluid, there's no oil changes, all those other things like that. And the cost of electricity is the equivalent of about $1.20 of gas. So even though gas came down, it's pretty cheap, it's not down to $1.20. So it's still cheaper to be electric. And on the health benefits, I think specifically with the buses, if we can replace diesel buses and diesel trucks, that's going to have a huge health benefit, and specifically amongst the kind of vulnerable population that lives along highways. You know, I lived in Marshfield along Route 2, and a lot of the folks that have houses right along the road, whether it be Route 2 or 7 or 30 or 14, anywhere around Vermont, you'll notice that, you know, there's a lot of low-income folks living right on these roads with buses and trucks going down, and they're breathing in a lot of particulates. And specifically with COVID, with its issues around the effects on lungs, we want to lower particulates. And so I think we should be spending healthcare dollars. Jen was talking about how to move money around. It makes sense to spend healthcare dollars to clean up diesel emissions, to improve people's health that are living along these roads, because the particulate pollution is quite bad if you're on a road that has a decent amount of truck traffic. In overall affordability for the state, we send $2 billion out of the state every year to import fossil fuel, you know, and the vast majority of that is for transportation fuel. So any opportunities that we can to keep that money flowing within the state with our own renewable electricity for electric transport is going to be just better for our economics and building a clean energy economy, which we want to do here in the state.
Yeah, I'm sure that one of the big challenges for working class folks is, while the life cycle cost of an electric vehicle may be less because that fuel cost is less, they still have to come up with that upfront money, which for folks with bigger incomes, the tax credits and so forth can help make that more feasible. But I'm sure with your lens and a progressive lens economically on this, that you're hopefully trying to find ways in transportation to make the original purchases easier for people, because then if they can start saving money down the line, it's sort of like the talk and work I've been doing on really expanding weatherization for fixed income seniors and for working class people's homes. They'll save money, but don't have enough money up front to make that a reality. It seems like that's one of the big hurdles for folks. Is that pretty accurate from what you've heard?
Yeah, and we did that last year. There was a lot of advocacy for putting as much money as we could into the rebates for electric cars. But because of that kind of progressive lens, you know, Senator Ash and myself and other members of the Transportation Committee really wanted to make sure we had basically a low-income program. So Capstone is doing that. It's going to be a statewide through the different CAP agencies, but it's just supporting getting low-income folks into either hybrid cars, because trying to get them into an all-electric car was kind of cost prohibitive. But if we can get them into a car that's just higher mileage, you know, you can get a used Prius that's going to get 45 miles to the gallon for $5,000. So that's part of the program. But if they can also get them into electric cars, that's also part of that program. So that's going to be rolling out soon statewide, specifically for low-income folks, to get them in either an electric car or just a much higher mileage car, which, like weatherization, will save them money over time on less gas costs. But maybe Jen has more.
And did you want to offer anything else? Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to add a couple pieces. Actually, first going back, Andy, I love the idea of the healthcare funding, because when I was running the weatherization program for CVOEO, that's one thing I was looking at, because indoor air quality is a huge factor, and it, you know, also negatively impacts the most vulnerable, you know, to a larger degree. So I was searching for ways essentially to make the insurance companies pay for weatherization, because why not, right? It helps improve everything, including the environment. But in terms of the kind of getting other folks into electric vehicles or other opportunities, there is also, you know, there are the current incentives, as Andy talked about, and then there's an example even in California, which I believe is called Replace Your Ride, which essentially is a very expanded look at Good News Garage, where it not only incentivizes for getting into a higher, you know, like higher mile per gallon vehicle or an electric vehicle, but it also you can opt to get public transit pass or funding for car sharing or ride sharing. So it's a little bit more comprehensive. So that may be another opportunity, particularly, and maybe, you know, we need to build out some of that infrastructure and a better car sharing model across all of Vermont, but that may be an opportunity, particularly down the road, to help support more lower income and you know, folks getting into alternative mobility options that are more affordable.
Great, thank you. I've really been enjoying this. I want to sort of hear about some more potential and or vision of what we think Vermont might look like in 10 or 20 years. We've heard about some great pilot programs that are being talked about now with microtransit or complete streets, and opportunities for working class folks to maybe get a first hybrid or electric vehicle so that everybody can benefit from these new technologies, both climate wise and economically. But as we wrap to the end here, would love to hear from each of you, sort of what do you hope transportation in Vermont will look like in 10 or 20 years? And that may include some other distribution of where are we living? How are we developing our state over the next 20 years? Jen, maybe I'll start with you on what do you want to see transportation look like in Vermont 10 or 20 years from now?
Okay, I'm going to test the video, but I may shut it off. I just want to at least chat with folks. But if it starts to squabble, I'll go back to the phone. But yeah, I mean, you just brought up the point. One of the pieces that I wanted to mention was, we talked a lot of kind of short-term opportunities, but also there's a lot of long-term, I think, things that we need to look at and start planning and taking action now. So be that land use patterns, smart growth, maybe more compact downtown centers. I mentioned I live in the islands, and it's one of many rural areas where wastewater and septic systems is a huge issue in terms of business development. There's one business that they don't have the capacity to wash the dishes, so everything's disposable. So it's hard to then you grapple with, you want to support local, but you don't want to deal with all this disposable product. So it's a real challenge, and sort of working on issues like that can kind of shift wastewater septic systems so that they can support businesses. I think COVID has also given us some light out of that. It's given us a chance to test out, sort of expanding out onto the streets and seeing that, we can maybe have a more of a opportunity to have a bit of a pedestrian bike ped atmosphere, and businesses having, outdoor dining and that sort of thing. But in terms of, in 10, 20 years, we talked, definitely about EVs. So I'd love to see a dramatic shift there on all fronts. And ideally, having more local resistance, having a microgrids around Vermont that are, ideally powered by solar, and there's battery storage. So there we can, power up our cars and buses with that, and across Vermont. And hopefully that the microtransit model has been successful and expanded to meet, the different communities. It may look different in different towns, but I think there's an opportunity there. And, just Vermont being a leader in this space. And we have, TCI, if I'm correct, we actually did sign on to the MOU. So that's an opportunity for a funding mechanism. And I hope that that's in full swing, and that we're kind of leading the way and helping to show other communities, states, regions how to, make this work, particularly in rural areas. So.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. Senator Perchlik.
Yeah, a lot of the same things, specifically our last point, TCI, which hopefully we won't have to wait many years, but next year we'll be part of that, and the region will be working all together to figure out how we can lower fossil fuel use while improving our local economies and making it easier to get around. I think we definitely can do that. I also want to reiterate what you said about smart growth. We really need to focus in on that. We need to have people need to drive less, that they are in walkable communities, and then these communities are connected. I think that we will still have buses and connecting these downtown communities where we're going to focus on development, but hopefully also we can have this microtransit so people don't own cars. So my vision for the future is that a lot of people have a lot fewer cars, and right now most families, every driver has a car. And hopefully we can at least get to every family just has one car. And then when they need more than one car, there's car sharing, there's co-op carring, there's microtransit, there's other ways of getting around. Plus that we have more people just living where they can walk and bike a lot easier. And then we really need to electrify. So I think that is going to happen over the next 20 years, where all of this transportation is electric cars. And so our air will be better and our economy will be better for that. I also want to put a plug in for trains. I think not only do people really want to ride trains around Vermont, if you are having to commute between like Burlington, Montpelier, or Burlington and Rutland, taking a train is a lot more efficient way to move people. But I think there's a lot of opportunities for regional cooperation with our other states to have much better interstate train transportation. So people from Boston can get to Vermont on a train, so they're not all driving up here. And as tourism, a big part of our industry here, we want to make it easy to people to get here on a train, and when they're here, not have to worry about having a car, because there's microtransit and good car sharing opportunities here. We're getting close to be able to get the train back to Montreal, having people get through Vermont up to Montreal and have folks from Quebec easily take a train down in Vermont, I think is going to be a big economic boon. And we're really looking forward to that and pushing hard on that. And a regional focus on train instead of air travel will be good for us economically and definitely for the climate.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to add broadband into that, because ultimately, if we have much better broadband throughout the state, folks might only have to drive to a workplace 2 or 3 days a week instead of 5 days a week. And that could also maybe change the transportation picture and reduce some of the traffic on our roads. And of course, we all recognize that there are dump trucks, there are construction vehicles, there are work vehicles that, some electrification may happen, and that may also be farther out. So I don't think anybody's talking about the idea that at this point there would be no vehicles, because we do recognize that there's economic realities that different professions and particularly construction face. So I want to thank both of my guests. Sorry, Kurt McCormick couldn't make it. I hope that things work out for him as best as possible and why he couldn't be here. But I want to also thank everybody who's watching. For me, this conversation was definitely informative, and some of these updates on, I didn't know what Microtransit was. I think that's really fantastic. And the work that both the state is doing through the legislature, as Andy is familiar with, and through nonprofits, as Jenn is working on, to provide transportation options that meet the needs of Vermonters while fitting the size of the state is a really delicate, tricky thing to do. But it looks like we're got some really innovative ideas happening. I host these conversations on a regular basis about all kinds of issues that the legislature is working on and issues that Vermonters have expressed interest in. You can visit the events page on my website, zuckermanforvt.com, and for details about future conversations, as well as you can find recordings and videos of the past conversations on topics like school reopening, healthcare, CARES funding, and many, many more on that website. You can also find these videos on my Facebook page and on the YouTube pages at zuckermanforvt.com. If you've got any additional thoughts about this topic, questions, ideas about other topics, please feel free to email us at info@zuckermanforvt.com. We'd love to take your ideas, your questions, and turn them into future little episodes of these roundtables. And thank you for tuning in and for staying connected. And I'll just wrap by saying, this might timestamp this a little bit, but voting is underway. Voting ends in the primary by the 11th of August. So if you got to vote by mail ballot, please get it in the mail by early this coming week, by the 3rd or 4th at the latest, to make sure the Postal Service will get it to the town on time. Otherwise, you can bring it to your town clerk, or you can also hand deliver it on election day to your polling place in your town. So thank you everyone for joining us and having this conversation on transportation. Really appreciate it.